Here with Geoff Mulgan, the CEO of NESTA. I don't think he really needs an introduction, but he's the before entering into government service, Geoff had a distinguished career in philanthropy, academia, and journalism, and has really been one of the great thinkers in the area of innovation. Today, he's going to be talking to us about his new book, Collective Intelligence, how collective intelligence can change our world. It's a big, ambitious topic, but we would expect nothing less of you, Geoff. So the floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon. I think I can take mine off and talk to you. And first of all, just thank you for being here. There's a pull of glamour and leadership over there, and you've chosen to resist that. So, and I hope we can have a conversation here rather than just a monologue. What I'm going to kick off by doing is just a bit of an explanation of some of the themes and ideas in this book, but then I hope we can talk about it, and I hope I will persuade you not only that this is an important issue, but also that some of the ideas I'm talking about here will change your life and your work and that of your organization. And I will make the argument we're on the verge of creating a new discipline, a new field, which is emerging, but not yet mature, and that makes it an interesting and exciting time. So let me start at the beginning. As Edwin said, my background is partly working in government and philanthropy and business, but also my PhD is in telecommunications. So I'm very interested in the design of systems and technologies. And in practice, that means always trying to look at how do systems think? How does a market think? How does a government agency think? How does the OECD think? Has always interested me. We're now at a moment when those questions are changing for several reasons. One is the obvious one of the ubiquity of data, talked about in lots of sessions here. How do you harvest data, interpret it, use it for prediction? And then, of course, the wave of different forms of artificial intelligence allowing us to spot patterns, to make predictions, to run cars, all sorts of things, changing what intelligence means in daily life. So in the little phones some of you are tapping on or looking at, there is quite a lot of intelligence there. And all the time, there are conversations around the world now which start with a technological capability, next generation deep learning, perhaps natural language processing, and try and ask, where can we use this technology? What I'm interested in is almost an opposite question, which starts from thinking about what would intelligence really mean in a system, and working backwards from there to what combination of data, hardware, algorithms, but also people and organizational structures would help, for example, the city of Paris manage its air quality intelligently, or a small nation's financial system, or a school system. What would a 21st century school system look like that really mobilized the intelligence of teachers, of parents, of pupils, and used data and used AI? So that was the starting question for this book. And oddly, there aren't very many good answers if you ask the question that way round. There's a huge literature on computer science and data science and organizational science, but surprisingly little on the design of intelligence in systems. There is a history of collective intelligence thinking, probably dating back to the 19th century when Francis Galton, an English scientist, famously observed in a country fair that people making guesses of the weight of a cow collectively came up with a more accurate guess than anyone could do individually. And that prompted the ideas which culminated in the book The Wisdom of Crowds about 15 years ago, which looks at how crowds sometimes can be smart, prompted many experiments in mobilizing crowd intelligence to predict markets or elections, find balloons. NASA ran experiments on balloons and has now generated lots of projects in healthcare. For example, people creating artificial pancreases with networks of collaborators, or something like Duolingo. So how many people here use Duolingo? Which is a really nice hybrid of smart technology, but also collective intelligence because it mobilizes volunteers to add new language pairs, like French to Mongolian, and then some of the people who do that get rewarded with paid work. So it's a hybrid of sort of really digital technology and collective intelligence. So to make sense of this question of the design of intelligence, I try and go back to basics here and really think of almost any institution, which could be your local shop or garage, your family, or a big body like the OECD, and what's happening when it thinks. And some of the answers are very similar to what hopefully is happening in your brains, even at this moment. You will be observing, you'll be seeing things, so sounds, sights, data. You will be using models which you have within your brain to predict your assumptions on what will happen when you act in a certain way. You will be combining memory. You know, almost all of our actions are shaped by memory. Sometimes you will be creating new things where your memory and the data don't tell you what to do. You will be exercising judgment, and sometimes you will be exercising wisdom as well. Now, if you break intelligence down into these components, it turns out very different methods are needed for each of these. Some are hugely influenced by technology, certainly observation, data, predictive models. Others much less. Judgment and wisdom are still slightly beyond the capability of any AI so far. And if you look at organizations, it's very striking. Some are very good at some of those functions and very bad at others. They may be great at memory, terrible at creativity. There are other organizations which are really creative, but terrible at memory, and so on. So as a starting point, simply having this frame of analysis for intelligence processes turns out to be very useful in seeing strengths and weaknesses. And in particular, seeing collective stupidity examples. Why do some financial institutions with hugely clever people and technologies make really stupid decisions? We can analyze it through this frame. The second frame then looks at what I call the learning loops, which is how we as individuals and collectives think. And a simple way of thinking about this is if you drive children to school in the morning. If you drive your children to school, you may one day find a traffic jam in one road. You will try a different route, and if that works, you will then use that in the future. That is how most day-to-day intelligence works. We have an existing model, new data comes in, we adapt our model. Sometimes, though, that hits a barrier, and then we find we need to create a new category to guide our choices. So in your town, air quality may become a really important issue, so you change your driving behavior not to optimize your route, but to reduce your contribution to pollution. And all real intelligence is both optimizing, but also category generating. And then thirdly, sometimes, if that hits barriers, you may need to create an entirely new thinking system to help you. And that's what's happening with driverless cars now, which are almost creating a new cognition system for driving. Now, why this matters is that many organizations are good at the first learning loop, though some don't even do that well in a systematic way. Many fewer are good at creating new categories, having second learning loops, and very few are good at the third learning loop, where you reinvent your way of thinking. But over time, all organizations or nations we recognize as intelligent collectively are good at doing all three of those loops. So where does that take us then? In about half the book then applies this theory to real institutions. For example, democracy, which we were talking about this morning. What does democracy look like when it's more like collective intelligence? When it is gathering many more inputs of data and experience and ideas from citizens, it has much more systematic ways of judging those, scrutinizing them, and then creating new ideas, remembering what did or didn't work, and so on. And I point to examples from Taiwan and the Taiwanese parliament to the Council of Madrid, which are implementing new models of democracy as collective intelligence. I look as well at the university. The world has thousands of universities, 150 million students, I believe now, but often, surprisingly, they don't apply thinking about intelligence to their own work. they often are stuck in really very traditional models of research, disciplines, degree awarding, rather than thinking, how do we become part of the problem-solving capacity of our society? I look at business sectors. What would it mean to turn, let's say, the housing construction sector of Île-de-France into something more like a collective intelligence, pooling data, explicitly learning, having labs and innovation processes to discover new materials or new uses of data? And why is it that so many sectors don't have even the most rudimentary organized collective intelligence? And I look at meetings as well. In fact, probably the most popular chapter in the book is the one which looks at the science of meetings and is very critical of what I'm doing right now, which is talking to you, and looks at what we've learned about what makes meetings really harness the brain power of all the people in the room, how most meetings in academia and business and politics are at odds with almost all the science of meeting design, which tends to require multiple roles, multiple media, much more explicit tasks and processes and so on. And if nothing else, maybe I'd hope you might read that one chapter. And then finally, I argue that some of the greatest potential advances of the next 10 or 20 years will come from what I call collective intelligence assemblies, where around particular problems, which could be plastics in the ocean, or the management of cancer care, or improving school-to-work transitions, we need to create new assemblies which pull together the different elements of intelligence in an orchestrated way. As an example, I use Google Maps, which probably everyone in this room has used in the last day or so. Google Maps is an interesting case study because Google set the goal of organizing geographical information, but did not have the capacities to do it themselves, and so assembled a wide range of different companies, technologies, to create what we now use as Google Maps, used an open API, so thousands of software programmers could use Google Maps and link it into other websites, and then through Google Map Maker, allowed the public to add in missing bits of the map. So it was an assembly of multiple elements. And I show that we've got emergent variants of that in things like Copernicus, around the natural environment, around epidemics, as I say, cancer care, many fields, which are beginning to pull together data, observation, memory, creativity, judgment to solve problems at a larger scale. But when you talk to the people working on these projects, they acknowledge they are making it up as they go along. They cannot go to any university to tell them how to do it, or any consultancy. There is a sort of craft knowledge of how to do bits of this within an Amazon or a Google, but not explicit. And so one of the things I'm working on now is trying to make this into much more of a new discipline, where we try and help people learn how to bring together the data science, the computer science, the organizational science, the psychology, so that we can do collective intelligence at a larger scale. Within NESTA, we've created a new center for collective intelligence design with partners across the world, private sector, public sector, universities, to codify this as what I hope will be a new discipline and a new profession whose task, in some ways, is very simple, which is to help us do thought and action at a larger scale, not becoming fixated on the technology side, the inputs of AI and data, but always looping back to what is the result we're trying to achieve, what is the outcome, how do we speed up the learning processes, usually involving many, many organizations and many, many people. So I hope that gives you a bit of a flavor of what is in there. If any of you think you have the answers to all of this, please let me know. If any of you want a grant, we will be announcing a global grants program in a couple of months' time for experiments which can drive forward this field. And if any of you want to take part in the creation of this new discipline, which will have an academic journal, conferences, professorships, again, let me know. And I would like to hope we will come back in 10 years' time with a radically different view of how this works, which has become really part of the everyday mainstream of how, particularly how governments work, but actually also how societies work. Edwin.
Great. Thank you so much, Geoff. I think that gives us a lot of food for thought. One of the things as I was listening to you speak is that I would posit that intelligence, all forms of intelligence, including collective intelligence, is at the service of values and common preferences. So for example, the European Commission has a directive on the right to be forgotten. So how do you see that interaction between the intelligence, which is only what's available out there, and those values that interpret that intelligence?
Well, one of the reasons for writing the book was the slight oddity that most formal investment in intelligence tools and technologies in the last 40 or 50 years has been guided first by better ways of killing people, by military budgets in the US, UK, China, Russia, etc., and then somewhat less by things like AI search engines or YouTube recommendation engines. Not much of it has been addressed to public benefit or public value or things which matter to people. So almost question number one is how can we be intelligent about intelligence? And that has to involve a discussion about values. I think there's a systematic misdirection of global brain power and technological power to things which are either harmful or don't matter very much, and dramatic underdirection of brain power and machine power to things which really do matter to us. So that's almost starting point one. And the OECD should be a champion of redirecting scarce resources to where they really matter. But as you say, we're on the brink of designing entirely new regulations and laws about algorithms, about data, about transparency, rights to be forgotten, rights to be remembered, which again, is not settled. There will be a lot of experiment and probably a lot of errors along the way. But what's crucial is that we, again, mobilize all of our intelligence in those conversations and don't see these purely as issues of security or commerce. They affect everything about us.
Okay. All right. And I think that the notion of the triple loop learning that you described is quite important because it also potentially shows the limitations of how the past and how the facts of the past and things that have happened in the past don't really stand up to paradigm shifts. So as in your case, the example was of the driverless cars. So how do you see collective intelligence as dealing with things like disruptive technology?
Well, let me give two very different examples. So one is driverless cars and drones are two potentially radically transformative technologies where some of the work which still needs to be done is quite technical. How do you actually get cars not to hit people, like the Uber car in Tempe, Arizona, which had, a design glitch which led it to kill someone. My own hunch is that those sort of technologies are much more likely to be accepted by the public and well designed if the companies deliberately mobilize human collective intelligence as part of their experiments. So getting other drivers to comment, to deliberate, to discuss what do they want or not. At NESTA, we're running a program on drones in 5 cities with national government and the industry trying to do that. So there's a much more open, iterative conversation about what we want from them, what we don't want from them. The mistake, I think, being made on autonomous vehicles is there's nothing like that. So as soon as something goes wrong, like the accident in Tempe, the only response is let's stop it altogether. So industries just need to be smarter about this stuff. There's another example, though, which is completely non-technological, but I think might be interesting for you, which I mention in the book, though it's evolved since then, which is the question of isolation. So 10 or 15 years ago, I suspect no OECD government had a policy on isolation and loneliness. This was a private matter. Governments did things like welfare or transport, but loneliness was a sad private issue. In the last 10 or 15 years, there's been lots more data and evidence about how, in fact, isolation has hugely negative health consequences, not just mental health, but physical health. More than smoking 40 or 50 cigarettes a day. And there's also been a social movement from civil society to start attending to isolation as a key public policy issue. Now that's for me a classic second loop learning process where almost a new category is being generated out of society, out of research, and then it's just becoming now part of public policy. So in the UK earlier this year, the Prime Minister appointed a Minister of Loneliness, not a minister for loneliness, but a minister to stop loneliness. And there's then a creative process. Well, actually, what can government do? How do you mobilize befriending, visits? What role can social media play, technologies to help? Because the great paradox of connective media is the spread of the internet coincided with dramatic rises of isolation and loneliness across the Western world. So we have the technologies producing perhaps problems which they could also be the solution to. But that's a second loop learning one, and probably any successful strategy on loneliness will need to be organized in a very open way as a collective intelligence, drawing on experiences, insights from many people involved in trying to help the isolated older person, but also perhaps a refugee or a teenager with no friends. This has to be a collective project, not a purely technocratic one.
Great. So I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I'm going to open it up to the floor for other questions that the audience may have. I think that this tsunami of information and data that citizens are faced with, it can be very overwhelming at times. And so people either employ filters to try to make sense of it, or they pay people or to curate that information. And so there's always this risk of creating this echo chamber where you're pre-selecting the desired results based on the information at hand. How do you prevent that, or at least how do you mediate those types of impulses?
So one of the chapters in the book is about the enemies of collective intelligence, and that's probably the more colorful part of this whole debate. Some of the enemies are quite visible and are being talked about here. Trolls, fake news, the ways in which social media can distort understanding. But many of them are internal to us. And I start the chapter with a quote from the Buddha, who gave this wonderful sermon to the Kalamata people in which he said, "Don't believe anyone. Don't believe your elders, don't believe the experts, and don't believe me." I think he's the only sort of religious leader ever to say that. But his point was, to be intelligent, you have to cultivate doubt and self-doubt. Don't believe the things you think too much. Michael Faraday, the 19th century scientist, was also very good about how education had to constantly sort of rebuild that willingness to challenge, to be skeptical, to doubt yourself. And so we need that at a personal level. We all have our own assumptions and echo chambers. But we also need to build stronger institutions which are the protection against the enemies of collective intelligence. And in the chapter, I list quite a lot of them. Some of them are very boring. You know, they're functions of audit, functions of evidence orchestration, and many others. But their role is to ensure that all the time in any debate, there is, in a sense, a pressure to get back to the truth or to the facts. And if we assume an organic process whereby truth comes out of open processes, we will be disappointed, often what we will get with lies. So this is a constant labor to defeat the enemies of collective intelligence. And there, in any real-world example, there will be powerful interests which want the collective to misunderstand a situation and act in ways which are against their interests.
Okay. Well, we at the OECD are big fans of open data and of audit, but we may be anomalies. Are there any questions from the floor? One in the back first, and then up front.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Fennel Waters. I'm with the UK delegation to the OECD. I'm really interested in, and maybe it's the same, this is my first main sort of forum that I've attended. I'm interested to see that a lot of the speakers are talking about behavioural change, and I'm wondering if you see collective intelligence and the raising of consciousness as different, or even if they are, if the correlation between the two, how you see that being a positive impact on collective intelligence going forward?
Well, maybe two parts of an answer to that question. So one is really about psychology. On nearly all the things which really matter about collective intelligence, it's quite hard to solve them only with data and algorithms. So that applies to everything from cancer, let's say. If you want to prevent cancer or help people manage cancer, they have to change their behavior, their understanding, their relationships with their family, with their peers. Or if you want to improve air quality in Paris or London, Yes, you can do a lot with sensors and algorithms, but ultimately people need to change their driving behavior, their building management behavior, and that gets you to psychology and social psychology. So one version of this is just about creating in this new discipline better ways of linking the knowledge of the computer scientists, the data people, with everyday human psychology, which sort of should be obvious, but actually isn't. Most of the AI for good projects, I fear, are doomed to fail because they simply don't attend to this issue of behavior and social dynamics. There's then a much more, perhaps ambitious answer to your question, which is in the last chapter, which is really asked the question, what does an evolution of consciousness look like? Which has been talked about many times in the past, and I try and reflect on, what might happen in this century where the collective consciousness of humanity really evolves in a meaningful way to a bigger sense of us and of now and of connectedness, etc., and learning. And I think that is a plausible, positive vision of the future, but it's not to everyone's taste.
Okay, so why don't we take 2 questions up front right now?
Hi, I'm Dave. I'm at the Education Directorate. Thank you for your talk. I have a question around how can systems prepare to leverage collective intelligence, given that collective intelligence is essentially emergent in character. So if a system tries too hard to control collective intelligence or have specific goals for collective intelligence, it seems that there is a fear of it losing its organic emergent character. So how do you reconcile this?
Okay.
Just what I was, about the driverless cars. There was a really interesting research about 1 year ago when they asked people, like, what should a driverless car do in a situation when it either kills the driver or 6 pedestrians? And when you ask what should it do, everybody, all the crowd answers, of course, it should kill the driver. But when they ask, what car will you buy? Everybody says, I will buy the car which kills 6 pedestrians. So do you have any thoughts of how should we approach such paradoxes about bringing both crowd intelligence and automated intelligence in such kind of stories?
Well, I think we're going to have lots and lots of dilemmas of that kind on almost the same applies to drones, it will apply to social media, financial behavior, where there is a tension between individual interest and collective interest. That's why democracy was invented, to try and create laws in an open process which answers that question in a satisfactory way. And I suspect, it will be illegal to sell a car which saves the driver at the expense of pedestrians, just as it may be illegal, to take your genetic data and use it to make employment decisions about you. Just as when the car was invented, a whole host of restraints on cars were created, road markings, speeding fines, drink driving prohibitions. So with every technology, we have to have a public debate about what is acceptable and what is not. As an individual driver, I would probably like there to be no speed restrictions, that I could drink as much as I like, and so on. But that's not where we got to. In terms of the systems question, I'm hoping we will be doing a project in the UK next year answering your question in relation to groups of schools. So what would it mean to have several hundred schools or several thousand schools more recognizably a collective intelligence without being overly controlled and contained? Some of that is quite easy. You draw on the resources of the OECD or others to look at the evidence about what works. So teachers don't have to invent from scratch what is the best way to teach maths to an 11-year-old or to deal with someone with special education needs. But then you would hope you might actually pool data in real time, so teachers could run small experiments, perhaps with a control group, trying out a different way of coaching or teaching or flipped learning. And as a collective of perhaps hundreds or thousands of teachers sharing that information, both at a formal data level, but also in qualitative ways. Now, this is to a degree what happens already in good school systems. I'm glad to say the head of the Finnish school system has read this book, so I'm hoping he will have a much better answer to your question than me, integrating that into a system which already has study circles, reflection processes to mobilize teacher brain power to improve the system. But the key, as you say, is that you have some, in some ways, control. What is evidence? What's really proven? So teachers don't do stupid things with kids, but you allow it to be organic and open enough so there is space to do a new experiment. There is space in the system to create a radically new kind of school, but you do that small scale in an experimental way with learning built into how it operates. So I don't think it's that difficult, but I'm not aware at the moment of any school system which has almost started with that as the question. How can schools which are there for learning be designed from the start so that they themselves learn? And my critique of universities, fantastic institutions for learning, is they are terrible at learning about themselves. And so there's a whole chapter going through all the ways universities don't learn. And I've yet to have a single university head really disagree with my diagnosis. So I would apply the methods they apply to others should be applied to them themselves. But I hope that's not an offensive comment to anyone here from a university. Maybe it is, yeah.
Not on that subject, but by definition, collective intelligence requires the participation of a large number of people. How can you prevent the infiltration of malicious intent to either corrupt or misuse whatever the outcome of your process of harnessing collective intelligence is?
So this is the key, I think, to the practical craft of collective intelligence design. It's neither make every decision with a tiny group of experts in a dark room in the basement of a government building, but nor is it completely open. So all the really successful current projects are not open. You have to almost earn some rights of participation. The more deeply you get involved in the project, the more you have to show you are not trying to disrupt it, you are a contributor. And there are self-policing rules, as there are in open source software, or Wikipedia, or all sorts of other platforms have learnt that if you don't have very active policing against the enemies of collective intelligence, you end up with stupid results. And I think this is where some of the ideas of the wisdom of crowds 10 or 15 years ago were a bit misleading, because they sort of implied just open things up and automatically you'll get fantastic solutions to any problem. That's not how the world works. Often thinking processes are quite labor intensive, quite complex, and often work best with smaller groups, and indeed the closer they get to real decisions, often the smaller the group should be that makes the actual decision, even if it's then accountable to a much larger group. And I set out in some detail in the book what I hope is some of the more fine-grained, so say, craft design of collective intelligence, partly to protect us from, I guess, the myth that if you only allow 10 million people to design something, it will be better. I would not like to read a novel written by 10 million people, to hear a song written by 10 million people, or to live in a country where the monetary policy was designed by 10 million people. But there are benefits of doing all of those things with some input from larger communities, but the detailed design is all important.
Geoff, so you're talking about how collective intelligence is arrived at, but does the architecture of that intelligence, once you find some conclusions, does that matter? And going back to the example of education, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation runs a network of teachers in the United States. And the idea there being that these sort of craft practices have more legitimacy when they're held with individual practitioners than if they're collected in some type of an institutional setting.
Well, there's lots of evidence about who people will listen to. Probably more research in health than in education. If you want doctors to change their behavior, a doctor needs to show them how to change their behavior, not a government or a bureaucrat. And the same is true in teaching, and that's why the project we'll be doing, I hope, with schools in the UK is very much to have teachers as the leaders, the agents of collective intelligence, but to try and build in a bit more structure and rigor. So I'm not familiar with where the Gates Foundation project has got. Their earlier project on small schools was an interesting example of not very intelligent large-scale action. As you may know, they spent huge sums of money supporting small schools, believing that was the answer to education. They didn't build in a learning model. They wasted the money. They sort of, in a classic, like a big bureaucracy, sort of covered it up and then moved on. But the key is to have structure, so you do try things out, you do use control groups, but you then learn and admit when things have failed, formalize the lessons, and then share that with the wider community. So that's it's not enough just to have conversation between the professionals. There has to be the rigor which comes from failure as well as success. And governments aren't very good at that either. Governments don't like experiments which fail. And yet nearly all real intelligence is an iterative process of trying things. Some work, some don't. And the faster you can learn, the better.
Hello, my name is Anne Papoulis. My work is centered around activating I have a deep belief that the imagination, the solutions to our problems live inside of the imagination, both of individuals and of the collective. And my work is centered on first activating the individual imagination and then accessing a collective imagination. And I'm interested in, because you're talking about collective, what I hear, and perhaps wrongly, is that it's an accumulation of individual knowledge. And I'm interested because two individuals can create something that one individual cannot create. And so is that part of your research, is that exploration?
So I'm very much not a methodological individualist, if that's what you mean. Interesting, have any of you heard of the anthropologist Mary Douglas? Nobody. Okay, so she was one of the great intellectual figures of the 20th century who did more literally than anyone else to understand how institutions think, how groups think. And it's fascinating, she isn't part of the mental sort of furniture of highly intelligent people, but she should be, because she has a detailed answer to your question and shows how different kinds of group, from very hierarchical ones to very egalitarian to very market-based, how they think and how the institutional structures shape their thought processes, which are not the aggregation of individual thought processes. So if nothing else, I'd recommend just read a summary of her, because it's more eloquent than I could say, and a whole sort of academic discipline has come out of her work. I guess my bias is then, so I do accept there is such a thing as a collective imagination, that most of the sort of thought I'm writing about doesn't come from deep inside an imagination and then appear into the world. It more originates from working on the world, from the interaction between people and groups and real-life problems, whether it's problems of water security or health care or crime. And intelligence grows through labor, through action and interaction. Very few solutions, I think, originate in the imagination. I think they originate from the interaction of our imagination with the world, and even more with working on the world with other people. That's the heart of alive intelligence. So I may be misinterpreting your question, but I guess I'm more part of the pragmatist tradition, which believes that that's how the world thinks best. And indeed everything from theoretical physics to genomics were driven as much by people grappling with working world problems as they were scientists sort of sitting in an attic somewhere just thinking thoughts. And very much this approach to intelligence is encouraging constant iterative labor on real problems. And again, another chapter in the book is all about what I think has been learned about problem solving at the level of a city or a country. How do we best collectively solve a problem like youth unemployment or crime? And yes, the imagination is part of that story, but is not the dominant part.
But Geoff, on this point, would you see imagination as something that would help in kind of visioning exercises to think about what type of future a country wants, or what type, direction it would like to take?
Yeah, and next month, if any of you are interested, we hold in London a big festival of the future with about 5,000 or 6,000 people, really just to explore imagination, to help them think wildly, laterally about, different ways of shaping, public parks, money systems, human implants, you name it, because we do need some ways to unlock the second and third loop learning, the imagination, the creativity, not just to think in linear, deductive or inductive ways. So yes, I do. But the crucial point then is when you loop back from the visioning processes and the scenarios back to your day job, and often that bit is missed out. And a lot of the scenario projects I've seen are interesting exercises, but they don't have the interpretation, the synthesis, the digestion of what that actually means for what you do next, what you do on Monday morning. And as I say, in our futures team, we've been trying to, again, work on what are the craft lessons of how you do that well, so the imagination stuff doesn't sort of sit up there, and there's a real everyday work goes on largely unaffected by it, which I think is what happens in many governments which have scenario exercises, visioning, etc.
So, okay, one last question, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Elizabeth Gauthier. I just wondered if you could just give us recommendations if we wanted to set up a collective intelligence sort of movement, a work to solve a problem. What would we have to learn? What are the 3 things that we would have to learn or know to set it up? Or do you give a method how to go about it step by step?
Well, obviously, read the book. Persuade all your friends to read the book, and tell me what's wrong with it as well, because I say one of the things I point out in the book is how disagreement is a really useful tool for intelligence, and argument. And so I'm really being quite serious. Is one of the things I would most value from an audience like this is reading the book and tell me where I'm wrong, because then I can improve and learn. But in more specific answer to your question, we are, through our new centre, trying to both find and support and link together people experimenting in this space. And the sort of projects we're looking at are some in education, some in healthcare, on the environment, or neighborhood management. They nearly always will involve some capability, and I say we're working with the UN as well on doing this in a development context. The 3 main elements we're always looking for. One is an approach to harvesting the most useful available data. And that data may be formal data, it may be data from sensors, it may be commercial data. So in many countries, mobile phone companies probably have the most valuable data of anyone to understand patterns of behavior. So skills in how to harvest multiple types of data, including qualitative and citizen-generated data. Secondly, tools then of interpretation and decision and discussion, which is a very different set of skills. So you can come to some conclusions about what is to be done. And then thirdly, building in these learning loops. So when things don't happen quite as you expect, that's a good thing, and you're using that to refine your approach. And usually we find in the teams doing this sort of work, there will be some very technical skills, say computer and data science, biomedical, etc. Usually some psychologists or organizational people. But then the crucial skill is the integrators, the ones who get really good at pulling this all together so the whole is more than the sum of its parts. That's the skill set we see most missing. And we're trying to find universities and other institutions who want to create a cadre of people who are better at doing that integration function. And if any of you have really good ways of doing that, like you do good, please share with us.
No, I don't, but I have a question concerning that issue. Does your book address the issue of machine learning and the possibility that machine intelligence may overtake human intelligence and what the consequences of that will be?
No, because I'm not that interested in that question for the next 30 years. Many of you will know there's a great literature on this, the singularity, superintelligence, and so on. There's some very good books written on it. Almost everyone I know who really is deeply involved in the frontiers of AI says this at some point will be a really important issue, but probably not in my lifetime. Possibly in the lifetime of a few people here, but not many. And the next 10 or 20 years, I'm much more interested in how we can be more intelligent about present problems than worrying about some theoretical future doomsday. That is largely a waste of attention right now. Read the books, put them on your shelves, come back to them in 30 years' time would be my recommendation.
That was really a lot for us to think about. Thank you, Geoff. You know, the objective of the OECD is better policies for better lives. So tapping into collective intelligence in order to think about what those policy solutions can and should be, I think would really be part of our core mission. So we will read the book. I would ask for your autograph, but I have it on my phone. So we'll have to figure out another way to, maybe your electronic autograph. But let's give a round of applause to Geoff. Thank you very much.
And send me the critiques.